Right guys, just a quick one here with very little commentary because this clip from Mark Harper needs to be shared around. He is calling out the government for making new laws at 5 PM on Sunday afternoon and rushing them through by midnight like 7 hours later on the sly without anyone knowing. These laws are incredibly far-reaching, putting serious criminal responsibilities on business owners and even managers that could see them in serious trouble. No one at all knew about any of these and most still don't. They had not been announced because they had literally just been made, like I said, on the Sunday afternoon and implemented into law by decree at midnight. Now Tory MP Mark Harper, like I said, called this out as well as others, but we will check out what Mark Harper said because he really got down to the nitty-gritty.
Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman and also my honourable friend, the member for Wickham. Let me just, in my interventions on the Secretary of State, I made the sort of synopsis of the argument I want to make about why Parliament should be involved, but I've got some very specific examples. Now, my own view is I still think it perhaps would have been wiser if the government had stuck to guidance as opposed to putting every single one of the rules into law, partly because we could then have acted faster and there wouldn't have been the same issues about putting things into the criminal law, but secondly because we could have kept the language much more straightforward and simpler, and I think some of the complexity that is inevitable when you legislate is part of the reason why citizens actually find quite a lot of this difficult to follow. But anyway, the government's made that decision. We're putting things into the law, but that does mean when you're legislating, it's important that this House scrutinises the government. And I'll give two reasons, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I alluded to in my interventions. One is about evidence, about what works and what scenarios we're facing, and the second one is about the detail of the law. Now, the first one on evidence, I'll give an example from last week. My honourable friend, the member for New Forest West, set out his views about the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor. Now, I don't share those views, but last Monday when they did their press conference and they set out their views about the doubling time of this virus, they said that they thought, Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, said he thought that the epidemic was doubling roughly every 7 days. It could be a little bit longer, maybe a little shorter, but let's say roughly every 7 days. That was the underpinning of the graph of doom, I think my right honourable friend called it, and it's been called widely, which set the tone for last week. But when the Prime Minister came to this House on Tuesday, that would be the day after the evidence was presented at the press conference, a press conference at which there were no questions permitted, the Prime Minister said that the day before the CSA and the CMO had said that the doubling rate was somewhere between 7 and 20 days. Now, those are really quite dramatic differences. The difference between 10,000 cases by the middle of October or 50,000. Now, I don't know which of those two scenarios is correct, but the point is they're not the same. And the reason why ministers should have to come to the House is so that we can interrogate ministers on the evidence, understand the problem facing us, and also understand the efficacy of the solutions. The second thing is on the regulations. Now, on the regulations that came into force at midnight last night, that were only published, that were only made at 5 o'clock yesterday, there are some very serious powers in these regulations that were not in the statements made to Parliament last week. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I broadly support these measures because they're about making sure people self-isolate when they're either test positive or when they're a contact. But there are powers in here, or duties in here, that are put on employers, which create criminal offences both for the company and for individual managers in those companies. Now, I don't know how many businesses in this country are aware of the fact these duties have now just landed on them. I would hazard very few. There are also measures in here which give the power of using reasonable force to enforce self-isolation, not just to police officers and PCSOs, but also to any individual appointed so by the Secretary of State, and also employees of local authorities, supposedly these COVID marshals. Now, that raises issues about who can use reasonable force, what training they have to use it in a safe manner, and also, given they are by definition using reasonable force on someone who is very likely to have coronavirus, how they exercise the reasonable force in a way that is safe for them, and do they have proper training? Now, these are all questions which no one in this House has been able to ask a minister, because these regulations came into force last night, and I have no idea. They have to be debated within 28 days, but that, that could be a month away after they've been amended several times, as we've seen already. Now, I just don't think in a democracy that is the right way to make the criminal law with important sanctions. They were announced last week, and as my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, said, I don't buy that there was no time between last week and this week. They couldn't have been debated. When government wants to, it can change the business of this House rapidly, and it can even arrange for this House to sit rapidly. And I would urge ministers to make those steps to make sure these laws are better scrutinised.
Now, I think you would all agree what the government are doing here is beyond incredible. If your business breaches COVID guidelines you did not even know existed, you are now a criminal. £10,000 fines and possibly prison sentences. Now, a lot of Parliament's debates yesterday was just Tory MPs shitting on the government, and rightly so. Some of them even joined in, going after the prize-winning Pratts, Whitty and Vallance, who gave us their bullshit doom and gloom predictions last week. That actually forced Sir Desmond Swayne to say this, and I fully agree with him.
The purpose of politicians is to impose a measure of proportion, a sense of proportion on science, and not to be enthralled to it. Now, I will make myself very unpopular, but I believe that the appearance of the chiefs last week should have been a sacking offence. When they presented that graph, with the caveat that it wasn't a prediction, but nevertheless, it was clear that they presented it as a plausible scenario, with its 50,000 cases per day by October, based on the doubling of infections by the week. Not once, not on one day since March, have there been infections on that day that were double that of the day of the week preceding. Not once. Where did this doubling come from? What was their purpose in presenting such a graph? It was the purpose of the fat boy in Pickwick Papers. I wants to make your flesh creep. It was Project Fear. It was an attempt to terrify the British people, as if they haven't been terrified enough. Now, I've been banging on about this since March, and every criticism I've made, I've been told that the government was relying on the best possible science. So I am delighted by the letter 1 week ago today, the nuanced criticism of Professors Hennigan, Gupta and Sikora. And I believe that it is now the government that has to answer that criticism. I'm glad that the consensus in the scientific community is broken and the critics are speaking out. I don't underestimate for one moment the horrible nature of this disease and its post-viral syndrome. But in terms of the United Kingdom's killers, it is 24th in the league, accounting for only 1.4 of us. And as a consequence, I believe that the government's policy has been disproportionate. By decree, it has interfered in our private lives and our family lives, telling who we may meet, when we may meet them, and what we must wear when we meet them. We have the cruelty of elderly people in care homes, disoriented, being unable to see the faces of their loved ones and to receive a hug. We have the tsunami of deaths that we may experience shortly as a consequence of undiagnosed cancers and heart disease, and the discontinuation of clinical trials. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Friend looked at the advice given to the Swedish government and the different policies they followed, and what does he deduce from that?
I deduced that that was much more proportionate. Of course, all sorts of criticisms are levied against the Swedish government that, on examination of the data and comparing like for like, actually are are without foundation. I certainly hold up the Swedish model as an alternative. The crushing of enterprises, the destruction of livelihoods, the unemployment that we're going to have to face now amongst young people, all as a consequence of an overaction. I understand now there's some question as to whether students are to be allowed to return from university at Christmas. Can I say most gently to my honourable friend on the front bench that the last administration that sought to restrain celebrations at Christmas was during the Commonwealth, when the Lord Protector, as a consequence, was left musing in public as to whether, if he were to arm 1 in 10, that would be enough. How many marshals will be required? There may, Madam Deputy Speaker, be a virus one day that threatens our very way of life. But this isn't it, even if we're behaving as if it were.
Obviously, we know they are not going to be sacked. I think it's actually them who are running the country right now. But I will do a full video on the clips I have from Parliament at some point, because the country needs to know that their MPs are not happy about this, just like us. Well, some anyway.
There is a pattern consistent throughout history of oppressed people turning on the oppressors, slaves against their owners, the peasantry against the feudal barons, colonies, Mr. Verhofstadt, against their empires. And that is why Britain is leaving. And it doesn't matter which language you use, we are going, and we are glad to be going. We're off.